Well, this is actually Harry Potter and the Theorists. I haven't done a lot of work on Harry Potter and the Critics, which is something else again. But what I really want to do today is try and ask the question why Harry has been so successful, which of course he has been. And that's an interesting question with various answers. And there's one that does seem to escape a lot of people, which is worth mentioning briefly. And that, of course, is that Harry has cracked America. Around about the time Goblet of Fire came out, Rowling's agents made a concerted effort to build an American fan base, and they succeeded very well. And it's worth bearing that in mind. I mean, Harry's American detractors, get a lot of press, but they're the ones that had him cut from school libraries, but they are a minority. I don't want to suggest that isn't happening, and I think everyone here can agree that it's very silly to try and do that, but one of the silliest things about it, of course, is it's not going to work. Okay. Harry has been banned from some schools, several dozen schools out of the several 100,000 that exist in the States, but he hasn't been banned from any communities. States can't ban books. That's a matter for federal law. I was in Texas a couple of years ago, and the first thing I saw off the plane in that most God-fearing of states was an airport bookstore full of Harry Potter stuff. So if your school library bans Harry, what you do is you wait till the weekend, and then you pester your mum to take you to a chain bookstore anywhere in America and buy you a copy. And everyone has done that. More than half of the Harry Potter books sold have been sold in America. All the footage we've seen of kids lining up around the block at midnight to get their copy as soon as it comes up are shot in America. The movies are full of British actors, but they're American productions financed by American money, and they have put countless thousands of American bums on American seats. So that makes the whole business of Harry Potter being banned in some schools a bit of a sideshow. And I mean, the best example the best way of illustrating this I think I can come up with is actually to quote The Simpsons, and to point out that Ned Flanders certainly exists, and he will cause a fuss, but everyone else in Springfield, including Reverend Lovejoy, thinks he's a complete nitwit. Okay, J.K. Rowling has conquered the states, but that's not what I could deliver an entire lecture about this because it raises some interesting questions about intellectual history. But I'm not going to because that's not what I've been asked to do. What I've been asked to do is talk about Harry and the critics and Harry and the theorists. And that gets us back to the question of why Harry speaks to us. What truth does he embody? And you might recall from my earlier lecture how the Romantic poets claimed that we find spiritually potent truth in literature rather than reality. Modern fantasy lit grew out of the Romantic movement, and I'm going to use literary theory, much of it to do with Romantic literature, in order to sort of talk about what Harry tells us. Now, this might seem like a silly thing to do, within the books, of course. What's the first point of evidence we have that Dolores Umbridge is a bad person? She makes the kids read theory. And it's certainly true you can get lost in theory. And it's a slide that's a slide jab by Rowling, of course, at teachers who get wrapped up in theory. And it's a fair cop. The point that occurred to me is that literary theories are a lot like the mazes that scientists build, or that we like to think scientists build to test hamsters. A scientist who builds a maze on the workbench in her lab, isn't going to learn anything. A scientist who builds a maze like that and then gets a hamster and puts the hamster through the maze will hopefully learn something about the hamster. So what I'm going to do today is get hamster Harry, basically, and run him through some of the mazes I talked about earlier in the course to just see what we can learn from him by doing that, because that's what I think we should be trying to do. So the first literary theorist I looked at in the course, as you may recall, was Zvetan Todorov. He was the guy who was big on uncertainty. Remember, he's the one who says it's only fantasy if you don't know what's happening. If we know what's happening is magical, then it's not fantasy. It's marvelous literature. If we know that what's happening isn't fantasy, it's just a trick of the light or some guy in a mask or whatever, that's uncanny literature. Now, Todorov's only interested in literature for as long as it remains fantasy, by his definition. He doesn't talk about the marvelous or the uncanny, which makes him of limited use talking about Harry. The Harry Potter books are full of weird and wonderful things Harry doesn't know about. We have fizzing Wisbees and marauding trolls and Hungarian horntails and all sorts of wonderful things that Rowling has either invented or more commonly actually reassembled in ingenious new ways. And keep that in mind. The question is, are we ever invited to believe that these things aren't real? Are we ever invited to believe that this isn't actually happening, or that this isn't actually magic, it's some trick someone's done? And I, of course, do not think so. We do have the early stages of the first book, where we have Uncle Vernon shouting no, 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 and trying to run away and going to truly cartoonish lengths to because he's a marvelous cartoonish Dickensian grotesque Uncle Vernon. To try to prevent Hagrid from picking Harry up and taking him to school. Does this mean that Vernon doesn't believe in magic, or should we take this as evidence that magic doesn't exist? I don't think we should at all. I think Vernon's actions are surely motivated by the fact that he does believe in magic, he does know it exists, and he doesn't want anything to do with it because it threatens his nice, little, ordered, respectable world. Vernon is trying to prevent Harry from going to Hogwarts is surely evidence that Hogwarts does exist and is magical. And then, of course, Robbie Coltrane says, "You're a wizard, Harry," and Daniel Radcliffe says, "I'm a what?" Because, check it out, his voice breaks between the first two movies. It's remarkable. And after that, we spend 3,000 pages working on the assumption that Hagrid was telling the truth, without any indication that he wasn't. And that's basically it for Harry Potter as fantasy, as Todorov would define it. He would define it as marvelous literature, and then, crucially for our purposes, he would stop talking about it. So he's not very helpful. And the same goes for a lot of literary theorists who follow Todorov's definitions and follow his lead. As I say, these people are when they say fantasy, they mean a very small group of German fairy tales from the early 19th century. And they've done a very good job of providing theoretical frameworks for those stories. But they're not really going to help us in understanding the sort of books we're looking at, because that's not what they want to look at. You can get them working if you work hard enough on them, but in a 6-week summer school paper, I wouldn't recommend it. There's a lot of theorists out there who aren't very helpful looking at this sort of stuff. So let's move straight on to the theorists who are helpful. And the earliest one of these, of course, as you may recall, is J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien, you'll remember, says that fantasy literature is that literature which takes place in the perilous realm. The perilous realm is the environment where the natural and the supernatural coexist. Now, I'm not going to waste any time suggesting that Harry Potter books don't contain the supernatural, because as we've just learned from Todorov, they do. That magic is unambiguously real. And so we've got our magic, and we do have people in this world who implicitly accept magic as part of their world, and indeed presume to teach it. So that's one side of the Tolkienian equation. The other, as you'll recall, is basically muggles, is basically some form of basic, unadorned, unambiguous humans, who can help us outside the book relate to what's going on, and crucially can see the magic as magical and special. And in Middle-earth, of course, we have the hobbits to do this for us. And you could make an argument that this is the case with just about all the kids at Hogwarts, who are, of course, at school to learn magic. And it is made quite clear that a lot of them are discovering aspects of their world they're not familiar with. Neville faints in herbology class. Ron is constantly screwing up his wand magic. Hermione screws up the potion and turns herself into a cat, and has to, or a cat-like creature, and has to wait to turn back. This is exactly the sort of thing that happens in fairy tales when you meddle with forces you don't understand. When Jack climbs the beanstalk, he gets himself into trouble and has to figure a way out. So in that sense, you could say all the kids are human. What's interesting, though, is a lot of these kids tend to accept magic very quickly. We are told Hermione is Muggle-born, but she doesn't seem that impressed to be at a school for wizards. She always seems to take it very much in her stride. Same with Ron. Ron's not very good at magic, but he understands it because it's part of his world. He's grown up with it. He's in a wizard family. He's grown up with pots and pans that clean themselves. So he doesn't really see it as magical either. He sees it as something he's got to learn and is having trouble doing. And of course Cedric and all the pure-blood Slytherins, of course, being pure-blood Slytherins, take it very much in their stride. But there is one character in particular in the Harry Potter books who does the same job in these books that the hobbits do in Middle-earth. And of course, he discovers this capacity in himself very early on when Hagrid says, "You're a wizard, Harry," and he said, "I'm a what?" This is a story with a lot of dimensions to it, but ultimately, it's a story about an ordinary little boy who finds himself transported to a magical world that is full of people and things and ideas he's never seen before and never thought were possible, and he has to basically get used to them and do something with them. And you'll notice he never does entirely get used to magic. He embraces magic, and that's important. He embraces magic, and he learns it, and there are parts of it that he becomes quite good at, like flying. He's an expert flyer very quickly. But he certainly never learns everything there is to know about magic. If you look at Harry's last reported speech in the last book that I can think of, apart from that odd little epilogue, his last reported speech in the last proper chapter of the last book is him asking a question about how the Elder Wand works. He's still learning at that stage in proceedings. So Harry learns a great deal in these stories. He learns who his parents were, he learns who he is, and he gradually pieces together the whole great Gothic soap opera leading up to his parents' death, of Sirius and the Malfoys and Snape's relationship or lack of it with his mum. But ultimately, what he learns is that there is this big, broad world out there that he never thought existed, where there's a whole new set of rules that he's forced to come to terms with. This is a story about the confrontation between fantasy and reality. The presence of Harry turns Hogwarts into the perilous realm Tolkien talked about, the no man's land between humanity and its imagination, where confrontation takes place. So where this confrontation takes place. So from there, we can talk about the three things that Tolkien says fantasy gives us: recovery, escape, and consolation. Remember, recovery is a recovery of the clear view of reality. Escape is escape from the ephemeral distractions of the here and now. And consolation is the consolation of the happy ending that so frequently eludes us in real life. I think the Harry Potter books allow us all three, okay? To start with, of course, Harry is in a time and a place I've always sort of thought of as contemporary London. Now, if this was a realistic story set in contemporary London, Rowling would have to include some references to contemporary British society. Harry would have to fuss with pounds and pence. He'd have to go to a normal school. There'd presumably have to be some reference to the credit crunch, some reference to the Tory Labour dichotomy which is destroying British society, which all British people assume is going on at all times. Presumably the Dursleys would have to cope with whatever Britain's equivalent of child services is. I don't know exactly what that is, but the one way that Rowling has sort of started to bring this in is, have you noticed how often a lawnmower is going when Harry Potter is at home with the Dursleys? It happens in at least two of the books that I can think of. There's always a lawnmower droning on in the background, which of course is exactly the normal sort of thing you would expect to be going on a weekend, in sort of middle-class British suburbia. That people all mow their lawn. And we'd have to that would have to keep happening if she'd set her story in contemporary Britain. But then, of course, Hagrid says, "You're a wizard, Harry," and Harry says, "I'm a what?" And suddenly the story isn't set in England; it's set in the perilous realm, and the lawnmower is suddenly drowned out. So we can escape, in Tolkien's words, all that ephemeral nonsense and focus on Harry, freed from all sorts of distractions, learning the rules of the world. He still has to go to school, but that's a wizarding school. Even if Rowling tries to present this as a normal school story, it's not. It's a story about a young person contending with a new and hugely expanded universe. So thus we recover, in Tolkien's words, a clear view of how that person reacts when he's put under stress. And Harry, obviously, is then put under tremendous stress in this world. Quite apart from the culture shock of the wizarding world, where ghosts exist, for heaven's sake, paintings talk, chocolates jump out the window. You have to bow to hippogriffs, or they'll peck your face off, or something. He discovers that there's some insane lunatic out there after him who's come back from the dead and has no nose and is determined to kill him. And that pretty much everyone, including the headmaster, is convinced that either he or Voldemort has to die for the other to live. Now that conflict basically shapes the last 3 books. And the situation just gets worse and worse and worse until Harry himself actually gives himself up for dead at one stage in the Battle for Hogwarts, as you recall. And yet, when it looks like all is lost, of course, Harry triumphs because of his incredible bravery in the face of all of this tremendous abstract danger that he's put in. Harry has gone through all of this to provide us with a happy ending. Those of you who have read or seen or grew up with Michael Ender's The Never-Ending Story will recognize the concept here. Fantasy is all about the happy ending, and this is what Harry provides us. And I don't know about you, but I find that very consoling. I think that really plays to Tolkien's idea of consolation. So as you can see, the Harry Potter books not only do pretty much everything Tolkien says fantasy has to do, they also provide us with everything he says fantasy exists to provide us with. And in this case, what that essentially boils down to is a meditation on the importance of courage in the face of difficulty. What Rowling has done is given herself an opportunity to examine that issue, freed from all sorts of political, economic, or religious distractions, so she doesn't have to grind any sort of political, economic, or religious axes. She's just said, what if there was a person bent on your destruction for totally inhumane reasons? How would you react? How would you cope? She's used fantasy to ask, in very abstract terms, what Harry is made of. And she has found him to be made of very stern stuff indeed. Now, that's basically Tolkien's recovery, escape, consolation right there. And different fantasists will take this in different directions and ask different what-if questions. Stephanie Meyer has asked the question, what if teenage boys really were as scary as they seem when you are a shy, insecure teenage girl? And she's written a what-if story about that. Rowling's taken it in another direction, and that's the direction she's taken it in, I think. So we've shown that Harry follows the Tolkienian model very closely. But that doesn't mean we can learn nothing about him from other theorists. If you remember W.R. Irwin from earlier in the course is the man who kept fantasy very simple. He's the one who said fantasy happens when an author uses something that's patently impossible in a book that's intended to be taken by the reader as a report of fact. Now that keeps definitions simple. How does it help us? Irwin's answer to this is, as you may recall, that fantasy becomes a sort of rhetorical device. Authors use fantasy when they want to draw attention to something in their book. Fantasy is, if you like, a highlighter with which an author can annotate their own work. Now, in the context of the Harry Potter books, that actually becomes really interesting. Pretty much everything, if you look at the first 2 Harry Potter books, pretty much everything is dedicated to defining Harry's place in this new world he's discovering. Yeah. And what's the first thing he's given after Hagrid says, "You're a wizard, Harry"? What's the first thing that comes to Harry? Sorry? Did someone? No? Okay. He gets money. He finds out he's wealthy. And of course, if this was set in the primary world, in our world, of course, he would immediately rush out and use that wealth to buy himself an Xbox and an iPad and everything else that a 12-year-old boy presumably wants. But of course, he's not in our world. He's in the perilous realm, like Tolkien said, the place where humanity and its imagination interact. And so Rowling can use that interaction in a very interesting way. And she uses it, basically, by telling us what Harry has to spend his money on. Can anyone remember that? No? Okay, I'll read it to you. So first year students will require 1, 3 sets of plain work robes, black. 2, 1 plain pointed hat, black, for day wear. 3, 1 pair of protective gloves, dragon hide or similar. 4. One winter cloak, black, with silver fastenings. Please note that all pupils' clothes must have name tags. And, of course, the rest of it, all of it. And you get the idea. This is, you've had this list yourselves, I think, or at least I've had this list. Everyone gets a few of these in the course of their childhood. Each one, it's the list of stuff you need for your first day at a new school. And everyone gets a few of those. And each one represents the utilitarian requirements for a new beginning implied by new membership at an institution of learning. Okay, Harry is starting school. He needs some new clothes. Everyone needs those. It's really normal. The fact that they are magical new clothes focuses our attention. Dragon hide or similar. That's a wonderful touch. I think you go to the school, you'll need some protective gloves, which is interesting enough to begin with. See if you can get some dragon hide ones if you can. Well, where do you actually go shopping for dragon hide gloves? People pay attention to this. It focuses the attention. Where does one get a textbook called 1001 Magical Herbs and Fungi? I think what Rowling is doing here is making sure we are paying attention to the fact that Harry is doing something very ordinary. He's starting life at a new school that is going to lead to very big things. And we like to think school will lead to big things, and for some of us it does. For some of us it leads here. For very few of us does it lead to a standoff with a monstrous snake demon who split his soul into 8 pieces. We may be thankful for that, perhaps. But the point is, Rowling is making sure we are paying attention to how important this new beginning is and where it's going to lead. And she's done that by combining the real and the imagined, by combining something very ordinary, a list of school requirements, with magical things like dragons and magical mushrooms and so forth. Harry is constantly being confronted with magical exaggerations of things that exist in real life. The firebolt is another excellent example. Most people at some stage in their childhood will covet a particular piece of sporting or hobby equipment. Okay, this is very normal. And you might get it and you might not. The important thing is you want it. Harry, of course, is a sportsman. He's dead keen on a particular sport. He wants some top-of-the-line sporting kit. And there's nothing unusual about that. But if it's magical sporting kit, Rowling knows we are going to be paying attention to it. And it serves to demonstrate, once again, what she's asking us to pay attention to is the basic humanity of Harry, really. He's a very normal boy. And there are countless other ways that Rowling does this, but that other authors do this. Hands up here who's actually seen Star Wars. Most of you. That's good. It's remarkable how much of an oral tradition Star Wars is becoming. There's a particular scene in the first Star Wars movie that I think does this very well. And that's the scene where Luke Skywalker walks out to the back of his uncle's farm and watches the sunset and just wonders what's going to happen next. And what immediately captures your attention about this scene is that he's watching the suns going down. He's watching 2 suns going down because his home planet orbits a double binary star system, supposedly. The history of Tatooine has been exhaustively worked out, by the way. The Wikipedia page goes for ages. But yeah, Tatooine orbits a double star, and that immediately focuses our attention on the scene and draws us in and says, what's going on here? What's the scene actually about? And when we actually apply ourselves to that question, what we learn is this scene is a scene of a teenage boy going out into his backyard, watching the sun go down, and wondering what he's going to make of himself. And of course he goes on to great things, but that's a very ordinary thing. And this idea of the double sun that George Lucas presumably had focuses our attention once again on the humanity of Luke Skywalker by providing basically a magical version of a very normal thing. And the whole wizarding world appears to be made up of these sorts of things. And they serve to demonstrate time and again that Harry is a very ordinary person operating in a very weird environment. The wizards have their own schools, obviously. They've got their own sports, their own foods. They have their own rock bands, I think, don't they? I think they do. They have their own newspapers. Sorry? No? They had their own newspapers, even observing the distinction between legitimate and tabloid press, which is, I think, what Luna Lovegood is supposed to be doing in the story. I notice they've got their own public transport. All of it is unearthly to one degree or another. One thing I notice they don't have is they don't have their own dance moves. Goblet of Fire was the movie was on TV the other day, and I watched it. And of course, they got up to the bit of the tournament later than the bit we've just seen. Where all the schools are gathered together and they're watching them about to go into the hedge maze. And all the schools are doing their school chants and dancing their school dances and so forth. And I couldn't help but notice that the Ponce French Magical Academy's school dance was the Macarena. And of course that's the director trying to come up with some visual representation of something that Rowling, of course, didn't have to come up with a visual representation of. She could trust her readers' imaginations to do. Which raises all sorts of interesting questions about cross-textual adaptation. But I have to assume actually the director put that in possibly just to add a little bit of swerve really to books that are in the final analysis, I think, oddly sort of sexually anemic. There's very little sex in these books. There's all sorts of love, of course. Love runs through the Harry Potter books. All sorts of love from the very awkward adolescent business of who's taking who to the school ball, right up through to that extraordinarily potent parental piety that of course twice saves Harry's life. But it all seems to originate from above the waist. People have tried to read sex into Harry Potter, and they've just about... You can if you read far enough between the lines. But the best overt description of sexuality that anyone's actually been able to come up with in the Harry Potter books is the bit in Goblet of Fire again, where both Ron and Harry notice that Hermione has done her hair nicely for the ball. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have had the thoroughly ambiguous pleasure of being teenage boys, but I can assure you that our aesthetic assessment of our female classmates does not stop with what she's done with her hair, which it seems to. I think Rowling has just about lost her bottle there. There doesn't seem to be a lot of sex in Harry Potter, with one really interesting exception. Does anyone know? Did anyone spot it? It's in the last book. Sorry? Aside from that, yes. It's an interesting omission in what's supposed to be a coming-of-age story of a teenage boy, and one that is so unflinching with regard to issues of how he relates to death and so forth. There's one character in Harry Potter that clearly does have a libido, and that is Sirius Black. And that is made clear in the last book, long after Sirius has died, of course, when Harry first walks into Sirius's bedroom for the first time, never having done so before, it occurs to him. And what does Sirius have pinned up on his wall? Does anyone know? He has pictures of bikini models torn out of Muggle magazines, pinned up on his bedroom wall. And this is interesting. Of course, first of all, I think it makes Sirius a much more normal teenage boy, really, than Harry. It's not a particularly likable thing for teenage boys to do, but it's something that a lot of them do. But of course, Sirius has been raised in the wizarding world. He's used to photos that walk and talk and are indeed animate, that are alive. And so for him, I think the idea of photos that just sort of sit there looking pretty must be almost as bizarre to him as flying broomsticks and fizzing whizbees must be to Harry. And that actually serves, it occurred to me, to define the two of them very much as kindred spirits. They are very alike, those two. They are both willing to embrace new things as they grow up and embrace new worlds as they grow up. I think that's fascinating, and I think someone needs to have a proper look at that at some stage. And I think it's very sad, really, that these two characters only get to hang out together on a couple of occasions. They're clearly very much of a piece. But beyond that little hiccup, I think, The point I'm trying to make is that everything is a sort of magically exaggerated reworking of our society. As we've learned from Tolkien, the interplay between those two things, the normal and the invented, are the real meat of fantasy. And what Irwin is saying is that authors deploy the fantastic to ram home that contrast. There's one other very good example of this from the first book, when Harry is on the train to Hogwarts for the first time, and he meets his first and best new friend. Can you remember what Harry and Ron bond over? Chocolate frogs. There's also there's every flavor beans and so forth. What we have here is a picture of a kid thrust into a new environment, barely knowing up from down, and what helps him find his bearings is a friendly face who offers to share some sweets with him and explain the sweets to him. This should be an exceedingly normal experience for everybody. But it just so happens that Harry is doing them in a society with very different ideas about what is possible under ordinary circumstances. By making him eat magical jelly beans, Rowling is drawing attention to that fact. And it keeps happening in the Harry Potter books, which do, if you look at it, actually have an odd fascination with food. These kids are always eating, and they're always eating marvelous things. In that sense, they're rather like the Enid Blyton books, in which the famous five and so forth are consistently shoveling huge quantities of food into their gobs. But of course, it's a particular concern in fantasy. It's always worth paying attention to depictions of food and eating in fantasy because eating is such a universal human experience that it's often used by fantasy authors as a crux by which to calibrate and illustrate people's humanity. And one obvious example of this, of course, is Gollum, who is such a desperate, degraded creature and they cut this from the movie, but Gollum eats babies. It says so right there in the book. Look it up. Because he's such a desperate, degraded, horrifying individual. Roald Dahl in real life apparently was a real bore. You would drone on for hours about the emotional solace you can take from a well-deployed chocolate bar. So in his world, of course, chocolate is an actual magical substance created by actual wizards. And then he calibrates his characters morally in terms of how they deploy it, in much the same way that Rowling does with the way her characters deploy magic. Lyra eats a raw seal kidney at one point in his Dark Materials. Pay attention to food. Always pay attention to food. It's a really interesting thing in magic. But all of this serves to demonstrate that Harry is an ordinary, frightened, skinny little boy. And how do you cheer up an ordinary, frightened, skinny little boy and help him get his bearings? You give him some sweets, or you take him to a football game. And if they're magical sweets, or if it's magical football, says Irwin, people will be paying attention to you when you give them to them. This is what Irwin teaches us, I think, about Harry. They teach us that Rowling has actually written a story about a normal person gradually learning to cope in a really strange environment. Now let's move on to Farah Mendelssohn. Farah Mendelssohn, as you'll hopefully recall, is the one who defines and categorizes fantasy in terms of how we learn about the magic. Now, as you may recall, all of the texts you're looking at in this course, I think, fall into one of her four categories. And that is the portal quest fantasy, where someone is taken from a world where they don't know what the rules, and they have to get someone to explain them to him. Remember, Mendelssohn categorizes fantasy in terms of how we learn about the magic. And all of the books are really about a person put in a strange environment, given a guide, who explains magic to them, and by explaining things to the protagonist, the guide also explains them to us. And there are some interesting consequences of that. But these ideas are, I think, entirely applicable to Harry Potter. Now, of course, the consequences are, firstly, the guide has to be reliable. This is the only way we or the protagonist are going to learn about the world. And so the guide, we have to be able to trust the guide to give us the good oil. Secondly, the guide has to have a steady stream of things to talk about. If they tell the protagonist everything straight away, then the protagonist knows all the rules straight away, and they stop becoming a human being coping with a new environment. They become a person coping with an environment they already know, and the whole pattern of the story falls to pieces. And thirdly, the guide really ought to be removed from the action at some stage, usually after they've told the protagonist quite a bit, but before they've told them everything they need to know. And that way the hero is thrown back on their own devices while they are still a human in a strange, inhuman world, and they have to cope with what they experience based on what they've learned. Okay? That confrontation, as we've learned from Tolkien, is at the heart of fantasy. And how the author handles it, as we've learned from Irwin, tells us a great deal about the protagonist. Now, these ideas are entirely applicable to Harry Potter, as opposed to Tolkien, who takes a group of rubes and puts them in the care of a single guide. Of course, Rowling does the same thing that Pullman does with Lyra, and indeed, really, that Lewis does with Lucy, really. He takes a single person, fresh off the banana boat, and puts them in the care of a bunch of guides. And of course, the first of his guides is Hagrid, who says, "You're a wizard, Harry," and he of course says, "I'm a what?" And that's the end of that. The faculty at Hogwarts, of course, are guides as well. They're teachers. Their job is to explain the wizarding world to Harry, and by doing so, they explain it to us. Go back and look at that first speech by Severus Snape about in his first potions class. It's a wonderful little piece of composition about the potions infusing their way through the veins of people. Tells you a lot about a man who, of course, ends up, as we know, being a spy of remarkable capabilities, a potion sort of himself. But then, of course, Rowling introduces Harry's preeminent guide, I think, towards the end of the first book, and that, of course, is, does anyone know? Dumbledore. It's Dumbledore who teaches Harry who he is. It's Dumbledore who teaches Harry why he's important, what's required of him, and what's generally required of him, of course, is terribly hard work. And that's important because it underlines the human consequences of all this magic. A lot of the syllabus Dumbledore has instituted at Hogwarts, if you look at it, is really about testing the pupil's moral fiber. Dumbledore's comment, "Dark and difficult times lie ahead," is a great quote, and it was used, I understand, as the tagline advertising one of the movies. But everyone forgets the second half of the comment. Soon each of us will have to choose between what is right and what is easy. And that's kind of the crux of the series. And really, what Dumbledore has done is set up a set of lessons and syllabi that will test that. People have joked about the sort of child endangerment at Hogwarts. They have said, what sort of parent sends their kids to a school that has an entire house given over to students who are evil? It's a good gag. But of course, the question that arises is, are they? And of course, the crux of that whole question comes at the end of the 6th book, at the end of Half-Blood Prince, where they get back from retrieving the locket from the cavern, and who's waiting for them when they get back to Dumbledore's office? Draco. And Dumbledore says, yes, Draco. Big, tough, evil Draco, come to do the Dark Lord's bidding. The only problem is, of course, you're not gonna, are you? Because I've been watching you and testing you for 6 years, and I know you're a right little shit, but you're not a bad person. And so what Slytherin is, of course, is the house for students who might be evil, who might be tempted to abuse their positions and their power. And of course, Dumbledore discovers that in the end, most of them don't. Most of them don't have the incredible sort of lack of humanity required to do so. And I think by putting lessons like that in Dumbledore's mouth, I think Rowling has enshrined him as far and away the most important of Harry's guides. Now, Mendelssohn insists that guides can't put their clients wrong, and true to form, Dumbledore doesn't put Harry wrong. Okay, he doesn't tell Harry everything, but everything he does tell him turns out to be completely accurate. Dumbledore's ability to predict what's going to happen and to explain what's going to happen, and indeed to sort of be a judge of character, is actually one of the most supernatural things in the book. Is he's an incisively, remarkably, magically gifted judge of character, is Dumbledore. But he also tells Harry everything he knows, and it all turns out to be accurate. But that's because, centrally, Dumbledore and his lieutenants are the only real sources of information Harry has about this weird new world. It's all he has to go on, it's all we have to go on. So Harry trusts Dumbledore implicitly, and if we're going to take this magic world seriously enough to be bothered continuing reading about it, we have to do the same. Harry's human responses to this world, and our responses to this world, are entirely shaped by the way he and his fans learn about the world. Now, Mendelssohn also says the guide has to have a steady stream of things to talk about, otherwise the narrative stalls. And for that reason, she says, fantasies of this type have to chronicle either a linear journey, like The Hobbit, or they have to take place in ever-expanding worlds. And again, His Dark Materials is an excellent example of this. You go from Oxford to this grand sort of steampunk world, then through various other worlds, and the world just keeps on expanding until, in my opinion, actually, he just about loses sight of what he's doing. But I think that the Harry Potter books actually follow a very similar strategy. And you can do that by tracing the development of the plot over the first 4 books, I think. The first book is basically very little happens. It's basically a very long, involved version of Rowling saying, wouldn't it be cool if there was a school for wizards? And then very little happens in the second book, which is basically Rowling saying, hell yeah, it would be cool if there was a school for wizards. And she loves this world, and she occasionally gets carried away with it. I remember realizing I was 200 pages into Order of the Phoenix, and all I'd read about so far was how nifty the wizarding world was. Harry plays one-on-one Quidditch with Ginny for what, 4 pages? I think, I don't know. And I began thinking, what, my friend Nicola will read this, and she thinks the Lord of the Rings moves slowly. Good heavens. But jumping back to the third book, we see, this is basically her saying, but yikes, what if there had to be a prison for wizards? And by the fourth book, we have been drawn into this great big wizarding world, which isn't just about magical sweeties. It's got a wizarding civil service, and it's got wizarding prison guards and magical prison escapees, whose escape reveals more and more about Harry and who he is. And it's important to note that the waffly bits, the bits which you could just about skip, are the sections of the book where Rowling is telling us things. Okay, the guides never waffle. Dumbledore doesn't waffle. He chooses his words very carefully. And Rowling, from a compositional standpoint, has written Dumbledore's dialogue very well. Dumbledore's job is to tell Harry and us about the world so Harry can carry on his role as a human being responding to abstract pressure. And if he'd done that all at once, if he told them everything about the world straight away, of course, Harry wouldn't have been human. He would have been something more like Gimli or Legolas from The Lord of the Rings. Someone who is going through some terrible adventure, but at the same time knows the rules, and this is happening within their ken, if you like. But of course, Harry has to stay normal. And so Dumbledore picks his words very carefully, and he doles out information to Harry very carefully and with great compassion for Harry's position. In fact, what Dumbledore does, really, is he takes this scared, frightened, skinny little boy gently by the arm and gets him to take a step back from his magical jelly beans, and then another step back, and so on, gradually widening the lens for Harry and for us. So again, the books are entirely shaped by the way that Harry gets told about the new world he's in, just like Mendelssohn said. And then, of course, suddenly Dumbledore isn't there anymore. Gone, very abruptly. And the last book in the story is about Harry suddenly having to find his way in the world without his guide. Now, this doesn't mean Mendelssohn's wrong. It means that Mendelssohn was right. Remember, she also says that the guide really has to be removed from the action so the protagonist can stand on their own 2 feet. And this always happens in fantasies. And a lot of the Deathly Hallows is about Harry growing into this responsibility, and it takes a while. He's clearly come to rely on Dumbledore. And it takes a long time for him to get used to doing things without his help. To the extent that I began to actually wonder if he was that likable a character, actually. He whines a lot in the last book, I noticed. But the important thing to bear in mind is Dumbledore was right about one last crucial point. He was right about Harry. who does turn out to be an incredibly brave, resourceful, humane young man who can put what he's learned to good effect despite not knowing the whole story. Okay. So Dumbledore, again, is the very picture of what Mendelssohn says a guide has to be. And once again, walking these books through one of these mazes has revealed that they are ultimately about very human ideas. Now, there's one last theoretical system I want to briefly walk Harry through. You'll recall David Sandner. David Sandner wrote a book mostly about 18th century fantasy, but some of his ideas are applicable to what we are doing. And he said all fantasy literature ultimately boils down to one key point. The point at which someone who isn't acquainted with the supernatural is suddenly confronted with the supernatural. And how they react to this confrontation basically determines how the story goes. So what Sandner is saying is that the whole Harry Potter story is shaped by Harry's and our response to a single piece of information that Harry gets in the first book. Can anyone quote it from me? I've been quoting it all afternoon. The single crucial piece of information that Harry gets is, "You're a wizard, Harry." Now, there are various ways that Harry could have responded to this. He could have told Hagrid to buzz off and leave him alone. He could have gone to the police and told them about this weird thing that's going on. He could have said, "Pull the other one, it's got bells on." He could have pulled an Uncle Vernon, and that would have saved him a lot of effort. And you could have had a story about this. Heaven knows. There's a lot of fantasies that do that. Dracula, The Walking Dead, Hellboy, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Independence Day. These are all fantasies that basically chronicle police actions against the supernatural to preserve our current position in the universe. And by doing the same thing, I think Harry would have maintained his view of the universe the way it was, and he would have saved himself a lot of work and a lot of heartbreak. Chiefly that arising from adjusting his perception of himself and how he fits into this suddenly greatly expanded universe. Does Harry do that? No. What does Harry say? He says, "I'm a what?" You just wanted to hear me say it again, didn't you? He basically asks Hagrid for some advice on how to get cracking on this revision of his relationship with the universe. Now, Sandner calls this shift dispossession. And he says it's dispossession of your current identity and embracing the supernatural as a sign of a wider universe that you are privileged to be part of. And by doing that, Harry lets himself in for all sorts of problems and difficulties. But he also, crucially, he moves up in the world. He comes out from under the stairs and he recovers Tolkien's words, a view of his own importance as a very normal person in a greatly expanded universe. I think what Sandner teaches us about Harry is that Rowling hasn't sent Harry to Hogwarts to learn magic. I think she has sent Hogwarts She has sent Harry to Hogwarts to learn that the world is a wonderful place and that he is an important and privileged part of it. And in light of that last point, I should perhaps close by reiterating Tolkien's comments about fantasy as escapism. Fantasies are not written because someone thinks the real world is too real. I think fantasies are written because they arise because someone feels we do not see the real world clearly enough and sets out to reorganize it for us so that we can appreciate it anew. And this, I think, is what J.K. Rowling has done. I think she's done it uncommonly well, and that's why her work is so popular. So, just in closing, I should point out, I'm not a Harry Potter scholar. My field of expertise is fantasy of a slightly earlier vintage. But there are certain inevitabilities that emerge by putting non-existent things in a book. And what the literary theories I've looked at here are attempts to try and delineate those inevitabilities. And by running a book through a system like that, you can learn a great deal about it. That's all I did to write this paper. So don't pull a Dolores Umbridge. Don't just read theory. But whenever you're reading a book or something, just run the protagonist through a maze or two and see what you can learn about them, because it can be very, very illustrative. And that is all I have to say. Are there any questions? No? Excellent. Okay. I'll still be about, by the way, for anyone who wants to ask any questions later in the course, so do come up and say hello.